Hello and welcome to the Kyiv Post Podcast with me, Rahim Rahemtulla. In today's programme, we'll look at the highlights from the April 7th edition of the paper. We'll be discussing judicial reform in Ukraine, and we'll be looking at how the business ombudsman has been doing in the past year. But first, we turn to the big news of the week, which is that the European Parliament has voted in favour of granting Ukrainians visa-free travel to the Schengen zone. Veronika Milkazyorova has the story for us, and she joins me now. Veronika, this looks like a victory for everyone who came out onto the Maidan during the revolution in Ukraine between 2013 and 2014. Is that how it's being seen in Ukraine?
That is exactly how it's being seen in Ukraine, because many people keep spreading the information in media, especially Russian media, that Ukrainians sacrificed their lives to get the visa-free travel from Europe. So what? A lot of sarcasm, irony, and so on. But for Ukrainians, it's not just a possibility to travel to European Union countries without visas. It's a lot more. It means that European nation finally recognized us as the part of Europe, and not like the post-Soviet bloc. So that's why it's huge news. But still, we have some formalities left. Now it needs to be approved by the Council of Ministers of European Union. It's scheduled for May. And then after that, it must be published in European Union Journal. It's like the official newspaper of European Union. And it will come into force 20 days after publication. So our Ukrainian authorities expect visa-free travel to enter into force in summer, I guess in June.
What effects do you think this will have on Ukraine, on the Ukrainian people, the fact that they'll be able to travel more freely within the Schengen zone? Is this going to change Ukrainians' view of Europe? Is it going to change Europeans' view of Ukraine?
I guess yes, because the fact that European Parliament granted us the visa-free travel despite all the Russian disinformation and discreditation campaign, and despite all the protests of far-right European parties, that means that they see us finally as a stable country that needs to continue the reforms, and that will change the views that Ukraine is some kind of a bogus land of corruption and oligarchs.
So what did Ukraine actually have to do in order to get visa-free travel? There was obviously a long list of requirements from the European Union.
There were a lot of demands: strengthening the border and the migration policy, asylum policy, electronic declarations, biometric passports, anti-corruption bureau creation and other methods of fighting against corruption, and also including human rights and fundamental freedoms. Anyway, our main advocate in European Parliament and European politician of Bulgarian origin, Maria Gabriel, told on April 6th that Ukraine has fulfilled all the requirements. So that's like the main point. They have no excuse.
Veronika Milkazyorova there with the story on visa-free travel for Ukrainians to the Schengen zone. We turn now to our second story, which is on judicial reform here in Ukraine. Our staff journalist Oleg Sukov was looking into this for us, and he joins me now. Oleg, judicial reform in Ukraine seemed to be going pretty well until last week, when activists raised the alarm over what they said was potential corruption in the process of selecting judges for the new Supreme Court.
So they're concerned because they think the results of the competition, the first two stages of the competition, could have been manipulated and distorted. Basically, the problem is that they think it lacks transparency, that basically the candidates who have a pretty good reputation got very low scores, while controversial candidates, very loyal to the authorities, got high scores. They even published a graph showing that the results of the competition do not meet the so-called normal distribution. It's a mathematical notion that shows whether a certain distribution of numbers is artificially manipulated. So that's in a nutshell.
And so is this essentially a case of the authorities trying to cherry pick the candidates that they want most to get through to be on the
that's the theory that the activists offer to explain this. They call on the High Qualification Commission to be more transparent, to publish the works of the candidates, to publish the profiles of the candidates fully, And as a result, I think that the problem could be resolved, but the High Qualification Commission so far has refused to meet those demands.
So, but this competition for places to the Supreme Court is just one aspect of the judicial reform program, which is extremely large. How does it look in general? Are the kinds of things we're seeing here, are they indicative of the bigger picture?
Yes, they are, because there are a lot of disturbing things that show that this judicial reform turned out to be a sham, like false reform, in a similar way to the prosecutorial reform and the police reform, which are widely believed to have utterly failed, with corrupt establishment basically keeping all their jobs. And like these reforms were very, very cosmetic and superficial. So one key point is that Alexei Filatov, Deputy Chief of Staff of Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko, and Alexander Granovsky, who is a great cardinal and top lawmaker, have been accused repeatedly of interfering with the judicial system. And Filatov has been accused by a judge, Anton Chernushenko, of interfering with his cases. There's a lot of evidence for Granovsky's interference also. Another key point is that the anti-corruption court, which was stipulated by the judicial reform legislation, is not being created. The authorities are refusing to do that. So this court, unlike the rest of the judiciary, which is corrupt, politicized, would be created out of like new people who have good reputation, like in a transparent procedure, and they would be much more independent than the current judges. So, but apparently the authorities think that they can't afford it because this court will be independent, and they fear that.
And finally then, this whole judicial reform process and the creation of the anti-corruption court, which appears to be a very key part, this seems to get to the heart of what is going on in Ukraine at the moment. We had the revolution. That was a call for rule of law, for greater democracy.
Yes, that was one of the basically demands of the Euromaidan revolution. Like an independent judiciary would guarantee the rule of law. It looks now that all the reforms are being sabotaged, so there is a counter-revolution going on. So it doesn't look very likely that the judicial reform will succeed.
Well, it's not a very encouraging picture at this point, but Oleg, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
That was Oleg Sukov on judicial reform here in Ukraine. We turn now to our story on the performance of Ukraine's business ombudsman over the past year. Staff writer here, Josh Kovensky, had the story, and he joins me now. Josh, what were the cases which the ombudsman was called upon to deal with?
The vast majority of their cases for 2016 related to the notorious tax service of Ukraine. That's a subsidiary of the State Fiscal Service, which is split into a tax component and a customs component. It was formerly led by a guy named Roman Nasirov, official who formerly worked in London at an investment bank there. He was formerly an analyst and then a people's deputy here in Ukraine, and then he became head of the tax service. He was widely despised by foreign businessmen and many Ukrainians alike, largely for allowing similar tax evasion and smuggling schemes to continue, and he was pretty unceremoniously deposed in February. So there's an interesting thing going on there. With his administration at the tax administration were the source of the vast majority of complaints as business ombudsman, who I should note, whose purpose is to kind of be complaints between the business community in Ukraine and the government. What's interesting about Nasirov in this case, though, is that the ombudsman told me that Nasirov sent a signal through the system, which meant that every time there was a case that the business ombudsman raised, it would be almost immediately resolved. So the tax administration, the tax authority, had like a 91%, I think, resolution rate, which means that they resolved in favor of the business ombudsman's perspective, of the business ombudsman's recommendation. In a sense, though, it's tricky, because all these things are resolved in a case-by-case basis, but if you talk about the systematic problems that allow corruption to continue, that allow businesses to get robbed, that allow people's tax dollars to not go to funding schools or social services or the war, but instead go into the pockets of oligarchs and wealthy businessmen. Nasirov did nothing to solve that, and the business ombudsman notes that there were no systemic changes. So
were these cases that the cases, the complaints against the tax authorities, which were then swiftly resolved, that sounds like it was simply a case of the tax authorities trying to keep the ombudsman off its back. Simply, whatever it came, it resolved. Meanwhile, the larger schemes carried on.
Larger schemes carried on, and again, the officials who profit from small-scale extortion of small and medium-sized businesses were allowed to stay in place. If you want to think about, kind of a typical case that they're dealing with, there was one guy I talked to who is a candy importer, and basically what happened is the tax authorities told him he owed around 10,000 hryvnia more than he did, forced him to pay it because by law, and he went to court against them. It took him 3 years of court to even get a decision saying that he overpaid, and then when he finally got the decision, the tax authorities refused to enforce it, so he went to the business ombudsman who had it resolved within a week. But the thing is that he got his 10,000 hryvnia back, but over that time, I should also note, the currency devalued, so it went from being around $1,500 to around $700. But the point there is that nobody was punished. The same people are going to continue doing the same things. It's just this very kind of Kafkaesque scenario in which people keep robbing and stealing, and sometimes they have to pay the money back, but no action is taken to really address in a long-term way, I would say.
But the fact that Nasirov has now been detained, has that had any effect?
In terms of the tax administration's behavior, Algirdas Shemeta, who's the business ombudsman, he heads the office, he said he hadn't seen any effect. What he said is that he would follow closely who replaces Nasirov. He said something interesting too, which is that he was on the committee that actually selected Nasirov, around a year and a half, 2 years ago, and that he did not vote for Nasirov, he voted for a separate candidate. But Nasirov was chosen anyway. So I think the point there is that to the extent that the tax authority is it's basically a cash cow. It's an easy way for a lot of dark people to get a lot of money fast. It's going to remain politically compromised and not independent and not focused on serving the needs of the Ukrainian people and the state budget, but rather diverting money into places it probably shouldn't go.
Josh Kovensky on the business ombudsman here in Ukraine. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for this week. Many thanks for listening. If you want to read any of the stories we've been discussing today, you can do so at our website, kyivpost.com, or pick up a copy of the paper. Until next week, goodbye.